America was never empty. 50 million people lived here before 1492. Cities with tens of thousands of residents. Farms that fed entire regions. Governments that had been refining their constitutions for generations. What happened to them wasn't discovery. It was erasure. This is no history. We document what the evidence actually shows, not what power wanted remembered. Let's start with what we actually know. Before any European ship crossed the Atlantic, the Americas were home to some of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. The Mississippian culture built Cahokia, a city larger than London was in the year 1250. Cahokia's central mound, Monk's Mound, has a base larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza, covering roughly 14 acres compared to the pyramid's 13. That margin may sound modest, but consider what it represents. Monk's Mound was built without metal tools, without the wheel, and without draft animals. It was built by people who understood engineering in their own terms, on their own timeline. In the Amazon basin, people didn't just live in the forest, they engineered it. Terra preta, dark earth, is soil deliberately enriched with charcoal, bone, and organic matter. It's still more fertile than surrounding soil today, 500 years after the people who made it were gone. That's not wilderness. That's a garden that survived its gardeners. In the Northeast, something even more remarkable was taking shape. Sometime between roughly 1450 and 1600 CE, and some oral traditions place it earlier, as far back as 1100 CE, a political project began that would eventually shape a nation its founders never lived to see. According to Haudenosaunee oral tradition, two figures were central to this founding, though the historical development likely involved many people across generations. Daganoweda, known as the Great Peacemaker, and Hiawatha, whose Haudenosaunee name was Ayanwatha, traveled among warring nations with a single message: stop the cycle of vengeance. Bind your nations under a single law. The result was the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, a federal system with two deliberative bodies, mechanisms to remove leaders who abused authority, and a requirement for unanimous consent before any declaration of war. For modern audiences, the parallels to bicameral legislatures and checks on executive power are real, though the Haudenosaunee system operated on its own distinct terms, not borrowed ones. Clan mothers held the power to select leaders and to remove them. A sachem who abused his authority could be warned, and if the abuse continued, his title was taken away. That is not a council of elders gathered around a fire. That is an impeachment mechanism. The Great Law of Peace also required unanimous consent among the 5 nations before any declaration of war could be made. A single dissenting nation could block military action, establishing a veto mechanism that predates the United Nations Security Council by roughly 4 centuries. The Great Law set this as its founding principle, though, as with any governing system, historical practice sometimes saw individual nations act independently. Scholars debate the degree of direct influence on the American founders, but the debate itself is instructive. Franklin wrote admiringly about the Confederacy's structure in 1751. The influence is documented. The credit, for a long time, was not. But here's what changed everything, and not in the way that phrase is usually meant. When Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, he brought something far more lethal than any weapon his ships carried. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza. Indigenous peoples had no prior exposure to these pathogens. Their immune systems had no inherited defenses. In some regions, 90% of the population died within a few generations of first contact. Think about what that means in human terms. Entire knowledge systems disappeared with those people. The Mayan civilization had developed a calendar more accurate than the Julian calendar Europe was still using. It had a concept of zero independently of any Old World tradition. The scholars who maintained that knowledge were gone within 2 generations of contact. And in 1562, Bishop Diego de Landa ordered the burning of every Mayan book he could find. He burned them because they were, in his words, the work of the devil. We have 4 left. 4. Out of a tradition that filled libraries, languages that had taken millennia to develop, gone within a single lifetime. Agricultural techniques refined over centuries, medicinal knowledge, astronomical calendars, political traditions, all of it dependent on the people who held it, all of it vulnerable. But disease alone doesn't explain colonization's speed or totality. And this is where the history gets harder. Epidemic became permission. When disease emptied a village, colonial administrators declared the land vacant. Then they claimed it. Then they wrote that claim into law. The wilderness was a graveyard that Europeans chose to read as a gift. May 26, 1637, before dawn, Mystic, Connecticut. A Pequot village of between 400 and 700 people, mostly women, children, and elders, was asleep inside a wooden palisade. English colonists and their Mohegan allies surrounded it on 2 sides. They set it on fire. Those who tried to escape through the gaps in the palisade were cut down. In roughly 60 minutes, between 400 and 700 people were dead. Massachusetts Bay Colony declared a day of Thanksgiving. The Pequot War effectively ended the Pequot Nation as a political entity. Survivors were enslaved or forcibly absorbed into other nations. Some Pequot people were shipped to the Caribbean as enslaved laborers, a detail that rarely appears in the standard account of New England's founding. And then the English did something that tells you everything about how they understood what they had done. They banned the word Pequot, not just the people, the name. Consider what that reveals about intent. You don't ban a word because you expect history to forget it naturally. You ban a word because you're afraid it won't. The accounts were written by the men who ordered and carried out the attack. They described it with approval. Captain John Mason, who commanded the English force, wrote that the destruction was the work of God. William Bradford called it a sweet sacrifice. These are not hostile witnesses. These are the victors writing their own record. And they still couldn't hide what happened. This is not a fringe interpretation. These are the primary sources. But the story of colonization is not only a story of what was done to indigenous peoples. It is also a story of resistance that succeeded. In the 1670s, Spanish colonial authorities in New Mexico were suppressing Pueblo religion with increasing brutality. They banned traditional ceremonies. They destroyed kivas, the sacred underground chambers at the center of Pueblo communal and spiritual life. The encomienda system, which required Pueblo people to provide labor and tribute to Spanish colonists, had been grinding communities down for decades. Pueblo people built the mission churches with their own hands, under compulsion, while their own ceremonial structures were being demolished. The humiliation was architectural. It was visible every day. One of the 47 men publicly flogged in 1675 was a religious leader from Oke-Owinge. His name was Pope. His Tewa name was Pohe Yemo. He spent the next 5 years building something the Spanish had no framework to imagine. 24 Pueblo communities, different languages, different political structures, old rivalries that predated Spanish arrival. He unified them anyway, and he did it using a knotted cord. Each pueblo received a cord. Each morning, one knot was untied. When the last knot was gone, the revolt would begin. 2 days before the planned date, the Spanish discovered the plot. 2 Pueblo men revealed it under pressure. Popé moved immediately. He sent runners to every pueblo that same night, advancing the date by 48 hours. On August 10, 1680, the Pueblo people rose simultaneously across the entire region. They killed approximately 400 Spanish settlers and 21 of 33 Franciscan missionaries. Within 2 weeks, the Spanish governor and approximately 2,000 survivors had fled south. For 12 years, the Pueblo people governed themselves. They dismantled the mission churches. They rebuilt the kivas. They revived the ceremonies that had been banned for decades. When the Spanish returned in 1692, they came back differently. The encomienda labor system was reformed. Forced religious conversion was moderated. 12 years of Pueblo self-governance had taught the Spanish, at considerable cost, that these communities could not simply be administered into submission. The Pueblo Revolt is the only successful expulsion of a European colonial power from a region in North American history. Popé's statue was placed in the U.S. Capitol in 2005, 325 years after the revolt. While other Indigenous leaders have been honored in the Capitol, recognition of Pueblo Revolt leadership came remarkably late. 325 years. Now consider this alongside everything we've just covered. In 1751, Benjamin Franklin wrote to a colleague about the problem of colonial unity. He pointed to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy as the model worth following. The Confederacy's Great Law of Peace had already been operating for generations, possibly centuries, before the Constitutional Convention of 1787. In 1988, the United States Congress formally acknowledged that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's democratic principles had influenced the framers of the Constitution. Scholars continue to debate the degree of that influence. The script is honest about that. Some historians argue the parallels are structural coincidence. Others point to documented contact between the founders and Haudenosaunee leaders at treaty conferences in the 1740s and 1750s as evidence of direct transmission. The debate is real and it matters, because the outcome of that debate determines whose intellectual history gets credited in the story of American democracy. But here is what the evidence shows without debate. The ideas existed. They worked. They predated the Constitution by centuries. And most Americans learn about the Constitution without ever learning whose ideas may have shaped it. The Confederacy didn't end when European powers arrived. It adapted. It negotiated. It survived. The Great Law of Peace is still the governing document of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy today. So what do we do with all of this? The standard story of colonization presents European arrival as the beginning of American history. The evidence tells a different story. It tells of 50 million people with cities, constitutions, and ecological knowledge accumulated over millennia. It tells of a demographic catastrophe so total that the land itself appeared empty. And that appearance was then converted into legal justification for taking it. It tells of resistance that worked. Popé expelled an empire for 12 years using a knotted cord and 24 communities speaking different languages. Deganawida and Hiawatha built a constitutional democracy that outlasted most of the nations that later borrowed from it without acknowledgement. These are not footnotes to American history. They are the story. Civilizations don't disappear because they were primitive. They disappear when someone with power decides the record should read otherwise. But the Haudenosaunee Confederacy still meets. The Pueblo nations still govern themselves in northern New Mexico. The Terra Preta is still in the Amazon, darker and richer than the soil around it. 500 years of persistence in the earth itself. Which indigenous leader or rebellion do you think deserves to be taught in schools the way we teach European generals? History isn't what happened. It's what was written down. We're reading the rest. See you at the next excavation.